to this presentation, Talent Identification and Development in the USA, specifically referring to football or soccer talent. So how do we develop and, or identify rather, and develop young players in the United States of America? Big topic, massive topic. We could go on all day about it, but we're just going to hit some of the highlights today. Okay? First, we're going to have a little look at the soccer landscape in the USA and how it got started to give us an idea of the context that we're dealing with here. All right? The footballing landscape, or I'd say the modern footballing landscape in the United States began in the late 80s when FIFA awarded us the hosting rights to the 1994 World Cup. So this event right here is when the modern landscape of US soccer began. Okay, we also surprisingly qualified for the 1990 World Cup, and we didn't even have a professional league at the time. So that was very interesting. And that sort of kicked off the passion and the growth of the game in the United States. One of the stipulations of hosting the World Cup that FIFA gave to us was that the US form its own national league to develop the game in the country. This led to the formation of Major League Soccer, which began its inaugural season in 1996, so 20 years ago. Over the next decade, soccer became more and more popular, attendance at MLS matches as well as TV ratings began to gradually improve. So before there was 4 big other sports in the US, baseball, hockey, football, basketball, and over about 10 years, from 1996, 2006, 2007, the game really started growing and becoming more popular because of MLS. Still though, the route to becoming a professional soccer player, so where did MLS get its players from? Right here, 3-step process. You played, and this is very typical of the American sporting landscape. All the American sports work this way. You play in high school, or you play, in soccer's case, you could also play for a club soccer. And then if you were really good at age 17, 18, you got to go to college on a soccer scholarship. All right? And 4 years later, the top players from college at age 22, 23 would get drafted by an MLS team. So MLS was largely made up, the American players at least, of ex-college players. And that was largely where we got our pool of talent from. Now, because of this, because the only way you could get players was to draft them, there was no incentive for MLS teams to develop their own academies, because you couldn't even sign them. There was no way for them to do that. You know, they had to draft them. That was the only way you could get players in MLS. Now, 2 things changed the landscape in America, and are changing. It's still changing, but 2 events in 2007, 2008 began to change the way that we develop young talent in the United States for soccer. The first one was that in 2007, Major League Soccer, in conjunction with the U.S. Soccer Federation, formed the U.S. Soccer Development Academy. This was an under-18 and under-16 league, all right, that would consist of the MLS teams, as well as many other youth clubs around the country. The idea was to provide a platform to develop the best young talent in the country. Now, this league had some features that were not common to the American soccer landscape at that time. These were the features. A 10-month season. So for 10 months straight, the under-16 and under-18 teams would play and train for 10 months. All right, they had to train at least 4 times per week, and then they would have usually a game on Sunday. All right, it was under-16 and under-18 to start with, but recently they added under-14 teams about 2 years ago, and in 2016, next year, they're going to add under-12 league as well. So we're going to have an expanding base of talent pool to work with. Another requirement was A-licensed coaches. All the USSDA teams had to have A-licensed coaches. So that was very important for the game, to have proper coaches developing our best young players. And there was a very stringent criteria for membership, and still is. So any club, soccer club, can apply to be a member of the USSDA, but you had to meet certain criteria. So a certain level of coaching, a certain infrastructure, a certain style of play. There's a lot of very strict rules that the clubs had to follow to continue to be a part of the USSDA. So having this now MLS starts to have academies now, okay, because they're required actually to participate in the USSDA League. So they started developing under 18 and under 16 teams. The other big event that started to change the landscape of player development was the homegrown player rule. This was in 2008. Major League Soccer instituted this rule, basically allowing MLS teams to sign players from their own academies whose salaries would not count against the salary cap. Now, the way it works in the US is you don't have it like in Europe where you can just throw money at a player and sign them. You have a specific salary cap, and the wages of your entire squad cannot go beyond this cap. But if you sign a player from your academy, their salary would not count against the salary cap. So this was to encourage MLS clubs to develop their own young players. So these young players became known as homegrown players, and that's Oscar Sorto. He signed for the LA Galaxy 2-3 years ago. Some of the more famous homegrown players that were developed in MLS academies recently was Andy Najar. He is from Honduras, and he was signed from DC United to Anderlecht in the Belgian league for 3.5 million US dollars. I think he was the first homegrown player to be signed. The second one was DeAndre Yedlin, recently signed by Tottenham Hotspur for the exact fee, I'm not sure. But he was signed for a couple of £1 million, and he also played for the US at the World Cup. The first homegrown player to play in a World Cup. So we're starting to see some positive effects of the homegrown player rule and the USS Development Academy structure. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to analyze a typical MLS club, in this case FC Dallas, and their academy structure, how it works, how do they identify young players, and then develop them for the first team. Okay, this is the FC Dallas Academy format. Alright, as you can see, you've got 5 levels here. Starts off with FCD Juniors. So these are 7 to 10-year-olds here who play for the academy. There are 700 of these currently playing for FC Dallas. You have the next 2 levels, FCD Select and FCD Premier. Now, Select and Premier are the same ages, about 11 to 14, but just different levels of play. So Premier would be more talented, higher level of play than Select. But FC Dallas has 1,700 players playing for them in these particular categories right now. Alright? And then the next level, the 4th tier, is their USSDA teams, under 14, under 16, and under 18. And they have about 72 players at the moment playing for them. So you've got about 2,500 players in the FC Dallas Academy. Now that looks very impressive, but what you don't realize here is that these 2 categories, the Select, Premier, and Juniors teams, it's all on a pay-to-play module. So you come and you pay a fee. Now in the case of Select and Premier, you have to have at least a certain level to qualify, but you pay a fee, you get coached, you get to play for their academy, you get to play in the leagues they participate in, and you get to be a part of the FC Dallas Academy. That's very different than what we see in Europe, where clubs' academies are completely for free and only for the most talented players. So that's interesting. We're going to discuss the pros and cons of that a little bit later. Scouting and identification. Because of the pay-to-play module, it discourages scouting. There isn't a need to go and find players. Players tend to come to you. So a lot of young players come to FC Dallas. They want to be a part of it, so they sign up, they pay for the coaching, for the academy fee, and then they become part of the academy. So at the moment, FC Dallas doesn't have an official scouting network at the youth level. They do have coaches who see other players and they bring them into the academy, but there isn't a systematic, structured format for scouting. How do we look for the best young players? How do we bring them into our academy? Okay? So there is a bit of unofficial scouting. Coaches will see players around here and there, or hear about this good player. Maybe their youth teams will play against another academy team that has a good player, and they'll invite them for a trial. They do also hold trials, sort of these large open trials for players at the beginning of every season, and they pick the best ones. And that's how they do scouting. It isn't systematic and it isn't structured at all. Okay? As far as the philosophy goes, the only very clear articulated philosophy they have is at the juniors level, so the 7 to 10-year-olds. ball mastery, so learning to keep the ball, learning to manipulate the ball, control the ball, shapes and support, so your diamonds, your triangles, how to support each other, developing width and depth, small-sided environments, lots of 1v1, 2v2, 3v3, 4v4, lots of independent player thinking. They want to develop players who are not only skillful, but intelligent and can make good decisions on the pitch. So that's an interesting philosophy there. At this age, though, I feel like there could be more athletic development. Could be more overall development, because these are all very sport-specific skills, and we know from the long-term athlete development module that at this age they don't need to focus as much on sport-specific skills as much as on overall coordination, agility, neuromuscular coordination, strength, speed, all of these things. Okay? Coaches in the FC Dallas Youth Academy. All FC Dallas youth coaches are required to have the following coaching licenses. So at the juniors level, you've got the D license. They must have a minimum of a D license. The C license for select, B license for Premier, and of course for the USSDA coaches, they must have an A license. So they do have requirements for certain levels of license for their coaches. This is slightly different to in Europe, where even the youngest age groups still have fully trained A licensed coaches in most big clubs. Alright, so we're just going to analyze quickly the strengths and the weaknesses of this system. Now, this system is FC Dallas's system, but it's generally most MLS teams operate on this basic system. So, the pay-to-play module, despite having many weaknesses, which we'll get into later, it does have a few strengths. And one of those strengths is that players can stay in the game even if they're not deemed good enough for the first team. So, like for example, they have 1,700 players in the Select Academy, Select and Premier. So maybe you're not good enough for the first team, but you might be okay for the second team, or the third team, or the fourth team. So what it does is, it allows players at least to stay in the game. And maybe the late developers, will get noticed later. So it doesn't, whereas in Europe, what happens is if you're not good enough one year, you're out. And then maybe that's the end of your involvement with the game. And maybe you're just a late developer, needed a year or two or three to develop. It's possible, we don't know. But I think that's one of the strengths of the pay-to-play module. Having a massive number of players playing for FC Dallas and getting training under coaches is a good thing, right? They've got about 2,500 players playing for them. That's pretty good. It's a similar structure to the LTAD module, where you've got your juniors, there's your fundamentals, right? Age 7 to 10. Select and Premier is what, 11 to 14 or so, 11 to 13, 14. And that is your train to train, right? And then up you go into the USSDA and you start getting into train to compete and train to win. So it does somewhat follow the LTAD module, not in all aspects, but at least in their basic structure. Okay? This is not specific to the club itself, but a lot of young American players do participate in other sports. They won't just play soccer, they'll also play one or two other sports, which, as we know from this LTAD module, is good for their overall athletic development. Weaknesses. There are many, many weaknesses to the system in place here, but we're just going to highlight a few. The pay-to-play module in younger ages means that you only get upper middle class players playing for you, because players from lower income backgrounds cannot afford to pay for the training and the coaching and the academy fees. So what you're doing with the pay-to-play module is you're limiting your talent pool. And you're excluding a very, very wide array of young players who could be very, very talented simply because they can't pay. And that's the biggest weakness of the pay-to-play module. The lack of a clear philosophy or style of play across the age groups, and this starts at the top. Okay? FC Dallas as a club doesn't have a style of play. It depends on the coach at the time. So for example, the current coach is Oscar Pareja. And Oscar loves to play. He's a South American, a very technical game. He wants to build the ball through the thirds, and he's doing reasonably well with that. But the coach before him, Sheles Hindman, wanted to play a long ball game. So he had two big, large forwards up top, and they would just knock long balls to them, try to win the second balls, and try to go forward like that. All right? So that's a big weakness. Substandard coaching. They need to have better coaches at all levels, not just at the top levels. There's no scouting network to speak of. That is a big problem. And of course, there's a lack of implementation of sports science. For as Americans, we are very good at sports science, generally speaking. But somehow that hasn't found its way into the youth levels, into developing youth players. So like at Ajax Amsterdam, for example, where they're working on a player's gait and running style and movement patterns and coordination from age 7, 8, 9, 10, that's not happening right now at MLS academies. So these are some glaring weaknesses which we need to solve. What about the future of the game? This quote sums it up. The good enough is the enemy of the best. And the US has produced some good players in the past who've gone on to play in Europe at decent levels, but we've never produced really world-class players. And that's because of this, the various weaknesses, I believe, in our development systems. Until we fix these things, we will never be able to compete with the Spains and the Germanys and the Englands and the Brazils and the Argentinas of the world. We'll develop good, honest professionals, but we will not develop really top quality players. And so this is a quote for us as a nation to think about how we develop players. It's good, and it might be good enough right now, but it's the enemy of the best, and it's preventing us from taking the next level. So we have to think about these, we have to fix them, and hopefully that will help us to really move forward in the world of football. Because we have some very talented players, but we don't have the systems in place to develop them. Anyways, thank you for listening, and for being here with me today. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.